think it's a nonsense to say, well, there's a magic number that suggests Labour would have too much power. Looking back at Boris Johnson, so Boris Johnson had a majority of 80. He didn't face a single rebellion for 3 years up until 2022. And the only time he got into any trouble was when his own backbenchers rebelled over Partygate. So was 80 too much? It's just a nonsense stick.
That's about the polls may not be able to agree on exact numbers of who will win how many seats, but they do tend to agree on one thing in particular, that the most likely outcome of the election is a Labour majority. I think the keynote of the entire election when it comes to the Tory strategy happened to be set on this programme when one Grant Shapps, normally Tiggerish, normally bouncy, sat in front of his flag with his shoulders slumped and warned about a Labour supermajority.
I think the simple point is that if you want to make sure that in this next government, whoever forms it, that there's a proper system of accountability, then we would argue that you want to make, you don't want to have somebody receive a supermajority. And in this case, of course, the concern would be that if Keir Starmer were to go into number 10, it will either be Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer. There's no other outcome to this election. And that power was in some way unchecked. It would be very bad news for people in this country.
That phrase, supermajority, has stuck. The Conservatives have continued their line of warning people about it. But on the front page of today's Times, Keir Starmer argues that a strong mandate is the best way to make changes his party want to turn Britain around. Kezia, is that no more than the obvious point, which is if you're in politics, you want a massive majority. You want the power to do things. You want a mandate to do things. They've been a bit coy about leaning into the scale of their potential majority because they don't want to sound complacent. But at some point, they need to show that they're willing to grasp it, don't they?
I think there's more to this than complacency. And, I was in London last week. I was in your studio, and then I went to see a bunch of different pollsters and have conversations about exactly this. And what's true about this story is that a 1% swing from Labour back to the Conservatives based on the current polls could see a difference of 100 seats. So that's the difference between Labour getting a majority of 100 and Labour getting a majority of 200. That's exactly why Grant Shapps has gone out there and warned against this fictitious thing called a supermajority. Yeah. What that tells you is that you have to vote for the thing that you want, that you can't be too clever or too tactical. Our electoral system in this country doesn't allow for that. So if you want a Labour government, don't think you can game this out. The only way to get that Labour government is to vote Labour, I'm afraid. So I understand why the Conservatives are doing this, but I think it's a nonsense to say, well, there's a magic number that suggests Labour would have too much power. Looking back at Boris Johnson, so Boris Johnson had a majority of 80. He didn't face a single rebellion for 3 years up until 2022. And the only time he got into any trouble was when his own backbenchers rebelled over Partygate. So was 80 too much? It's just a nonsense stick.
It's a nonsense, William. Do you think it's worked at all? Is it squeezing the reform vote? Maybe it's a nonsense that has to be done because you want fewer people to turn their back on the Tories and vote reform.
Yes, hopefully it is doing that, because I definitely agree that it's not healthy to have a vast majority of one side. So on this, I disagree with Kezia about this. Of course, any party wants a large majority if it can. And of course, it's very hard for a voter to calibrate their vote because they don't know how everybody else is going to vote. But I do think in this country, we're electing a government and a parliament at the same time. That's advantageous in many ways. It means we don't have the French situation where they may be about to have a president and a parliament who are completely opposed to each other. But we do it at the same time. You can end up with a good government, but a bad parliament. And that we're heading for, whatever we think of a Labour government, a bad parliament with a huge majority, because they've just been marking their own homework. A parliament is effective if committees are hauling ministers before them and asking tough questions, and there are plenty of people on the opposition benches to shadow the government of the day. And if you don't really have that, the government has 8 seats on every committee out of 11 seats, which is what you would have on some of these detailed forecasts of how the seats are going to go. That's not going to be an effective parliament for the next 4 or 5 years. So I do think there is a danger in a very big majority.
William, I just
William,
Oh, go on.
This is coming from a party who, when they didn't like what Parliament did, they shut it down. The Tories are not bastions of a better democracy. If you want a better democracy, you've got to reform the electoral system. If you want to avoid supermajorities, let's have a system where every vote counts. Conservatives rally against any sort of electoral reform and then cry like babies when the system is going to give them the result they don't like.
William?
Well, I was very critical of them suspending Parliament and the prorogation of Parliament. So I'm not claiming any virtue for the Conservative Party here. I'm saying under any government of any party, if in Parliament there aren't enough people to hold it to account and to fill those committees and so on, that's not going to lead to good government or a good Parliament. So I wasn't really making a point about any particular political party, just that it will be an unhealthy situation, and I think it will be.
William, I'm really interested in what you think, actually, just finally on this topic of the kind of the change in message that Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives have kind of gone through. You know, they've gone through, we have a plan, Labour have no plan. Then they've gone to supermajority. Then they've talked about... then Rishi said, "You're frustrated with me a lot. I apologise. I understand." And then finally, you know, lend me, trust me, give me your votes to stop going back to this supermajority. So obviously the messages have changed, which is quite unusual, I think, for them to change so radically during an election campaign. Do you think they've been in the right order? Do you think they've been the right messages, or any of them that you would have changed?
Well, there are, you know, if you say exactly the same thing every day, you soon run out of anybody covering it all. So it's not exactly the same. I think the Conservative campaign is probably finishing up very much where it began, in warning about the problems of a Labour government. And Rishi Sunak's done some very energetic performances in the media, but by common consent, actually, again, whatever side you're on, setting out his own ambitions as well as his fears about the Labour Party. I think this, you know, diversion, as it were, into warning about a supermajority grant chaps and so on that you were quoting earlier, is the inevitable result of opinion polls dominating an election campaign. That's a bad thing. I think that we have so many polls that they are the story. And you can't say to a party, look, every day, you can say, look, you're losing, you are 20 points behind. But ignore that, ignore us, we're just saying you're finished, and forget about it.
But William, even if there'd been fewer polls, they would still be saying terrible things, wouldn't they? So they're hard to ignore.
Well, it wouldn't be so much the focus. You have every day one of these MRP surveys that says that, you know, there's only going to be one Conservative MP or something like you know, about 80, 100, whatever it may be, but not many. And, you know, of course, then parties end up responding to that as the story. They can't ignore that situation. The voter can't ignore that situation if there's so much evidence that might be happening.